In today's episode, we dive into 3 horrifying cases where water turned from a place of fun into a scene of terror. From a relaxing road trip that turned into a nightmare when a car plunged off a cliff straight into a pack of hungry sharks, to 2 surfers who braved South Africa's famous waves only to be hunted by the same relentless great white. But first, let's begin with the story of 16-year-old Stella. February 4th, 2023 was a scorching summer day in North Fremantle, Australia. Like many other teenagers seeking relief from the relentless heat, 16-year-old Stella Berry and her friends decided to cool off at the Swan River, a popular but seemingly safe alternative to the crowded beaches along the western coast. The river, winding through Perth before spilling into the Indian Ocean, was a familiar hangout spot, a place where they could swim, sunbathe, and enjoy the carefree days of youth. That afternoon, the group arrived at their usual spot along the riverbank, where the water was calm and inviting. They splashed around for a while, floating in the cool water and laughing under the sun. The river, sheltered from ocean waves and teeming with life, felt like the perfect escape. Stella and her friends were enjoying what seemed to be an idyllic summer day, unaware that danger was lurking beneath the surface. At around 3:30 p.m., as the group lounged by the water's edge, something caught Stella's eye, a flash of gray cutting through the river. She sat up, watching as a pod of dolphins appeared, their sleek bodies surfacing as they moved in unison toward the ocean. The sight was mesmerizing. Dolphins were a common but always thrilling presence in the Swan River, and their sudden appearance sent a wave of excitement through the group. Without hesitation, Stella made a decision that would change everything. She jumped into the water. Wanting to get closer to the dolphins, she waded in, paddling toward the pod with a mix of awe and exhilaration. But what she didn't realize was that she wasn't alone in the water. The dolphins had company, a bull shark. Unlike great white sharks, which typically patrol deeper ocean waters, bull sharks have a unique ability that makes them even more dangerous. They can survive in both saltwater and fresh water. Utilizing special glands and kidney adaptations, they can regulate salt levels in their bodies, allowing them to swim far up rivers and estuaries where most other sharks wouldn't survive. This makes them one of the few shark species that can come into direct contact with humans in environments that seem completely safe. And on that day, one had been following the dolphins. As Stella swam out, the bull shark lurked beneath the murky water, its instincts honed by millions of years of evolution. It had been hunting in the river, likely drawn in by the scent of fish or even the dolphins themselves. But in that moment, as it sensed the movement above, its focus shifted. Stella had no idea the terror lurking beneath her. The water was clear near the surface, but the depths concealed a predator that was about to strike. And just as she reached the dolphins, everything changed in an instant. The bull shark surged forward. Stella barely had time to react before an excruciating pain tore through her leg. A force unlike anything she'd ever felt yanked her downward, sending shockwaves of agony through her body. Instinctively, she thrashed, kicking and clawing at whatever had clamped onto her. But her frantic movements only seemed to fuel the predator's aggression. As the water around her turned red, the truth became horrifyingly clear. She was in the jaws of a bull shark. Her screams echoed across the river, piercing through the humid summer air. On the shore, her friends watched in terror, calling her name, pleading for her to fight. But they were powerless. The attack was unfolding right in front of them, but there was nothing they could do except scream for help. Every second felt like an eternity. The water churned violently as the shark dragged her beneath the surface, then let go for just a moment, circling back as if to strike again. Stella fought to keep her head above water, gasping for air as waves of panic and pain surged through her. Her leg felt like it was on fire, the wound gushing blood into the river, attracting the shark even more. The predator, sensing its prey weakening, moved in again, its powerful body slicing through the water with terrifying ease. She kicked with everything she had left, desperate to break free, but her strength was fading. The onlookers on shore could see the massive shadow moving beneath the surface, stalking her. It was a battle of survival, and Stella was running out of time. Just then, a man standing nearby sprang into action. Without hesitation, he plunged into the river, battling against the current as he raced toward Stella. The shark had disappeared for a moment, slipping into the depths, and the man seized his chance. He grabbed hold of her and with all his strength pulled her toward the shore. But Stella's body was limp. She had lost consciousness, whether from the blood loss, shock, or sheer exhaustion, no one could tell. The rescuer fought against the weight of her body, the pull of the water, and the looming fear that the shark could return at any second. By the time he reached the riverbank, emergency responders had already arrived. Police boats patrolled the area, sirens blaring as paramedics rushed forward to attend to Stella. Every second counted. The paramedics worked frantically, applying pressure to her wounds, but the extent of her injuries was catastrophic. The bite had severed arteries, and despite their best efforts, there was nothing they could do. Stella's life slipped away on the banks of the Swan River, her bright future stolen in a heartbeat. The teenage girl who had just moments ago been chasing dolphins was gone. As the news of Stella's death spread, authorities wasted no time in issuing a public warning. They urged people to stay out of the water while a search for the shark was conducted. No one wanted to take another risk. A day later, a 2.5-meter bull shark was caught about a kilometer upstream from where the attack had occurred. Local fishermen had used bait to lure the predator, but what shocked them most was the direction it had come from. Instead of returning to the ocean, the shark had remained deep in the river, far from where people would typically expect such a threat. Rather than euthanizing the animal, officers made the decision to relocate it far out into the ocean, hoping it wouldn't return. Some believed this was the right thing to do. The shark had simply acted on instinct. In the murky water, it may have mistaken Stella for one of the dolphins. But since she was swimming alone, separate from the pod, she became the easier target. Whether a case of mistaken identity or a deliberate strike, the result was the same: a young life lost too soon. The community was shaken. The Swan River had not seen a fatal shark attack in over a century, yet tragedy had struck when no one expected it. Stella's friends, family, and classmates gathered for a vigil, placing flowers and candles at the riverside in her memory. They spoke of her kindness, her infectious energy, and her dreams of traveling the world. She had been a talented athlete, a dedicated hockey player, and a beloved friend. Her loss was immeasurable. Despite reassurances from officials that shark attacks in the river were incredibly rare, the reality remained. Wherever there's water, there's always risk. Stella Berry had no idea that an ordinary summer afternoon would end in horror, that she would become another reminder of nature's unforgiving force. This wasn't the only time the waters of Australia took someone's life. They have always been dangerous. They were cruel enough to end the lives of a group of friends, too. It was 1967 in Sydney, Australia. A group of friends set out for what was supposed to be a fun and relaxing day. There were 4 of them in total, 3 adults and 1 child packed into a car, cruising along the coastline, enjoying the scenic drive. The road took them through Dover Heights, an eastern suburb of Sydney known for its breathtaking cliffs that towered over the Pacific Ocean. But on this particular day, those views were obscured by thick autumn fog that rolled in from the sea, turning the drive into something far more dangerous. The mist hung heavy, shrouding the road ahead, making it difficult to see more than a few feet in front of the car. Still, they pressed on, unaware of the tragedy about to unfold. As they made their way along the winding cliffside roads, the child in the back seat began to fidget. He had dropped something onto the floor and couldn't reach it. Frustrated, he started to cry, his small voice cutting through the muffled quiet of the foggy morning. The driver, trying to soothe him, made a split-second mistake. He reached back to grab the item without stopping the car. His hands fumbled in the footwell. His attention diverted from the road just long enough for disaster to strike. By the time he realized he had veered too far to the left, it was already too late. The tires screeched as he slammed the brakes, but momentum carried the car forward. It crashed through the metal safety barrier, shattering it into pieces. The vehicle shot through the air, the passengers screaming as gravity took hold. The car didn't fall directly into the sea, not at first. Instead, it smashed into jagged rocks jutting out from the cliff face, coming to a sickening halt in a near vertical position. It dangled precariously, its front end tilting downward toward the waves far below. The violent impact threw the front passenger forward with incredible force, sending her hurtling straight through the windshield. She plummeted 100 feet, her body spinning through the air before slamming into the ocean. The moment she hit the water, she didn't move. The impact alone may have been enough to take her life, but even if she had survived the fall, she would never make it back to shore. Within moments, the ocean around her darkened as sleek, shadowy shapes rushed toward her. The splash had drawn them in, and the scent of fresh blood sealed her fate. A frenzy erupted in the water as 14 sharks swarmed her lifeless body, tearing into her with unrelenting savagery. From the precarious wreckage above, the driver watched in horror. The once serene water had turned into a bubbling, thrashing mass of fins, tails, and teeth. The ocean turned red as the woman's body disappeared beneath the chaos. His stomach clenched with fear as he turned his attention to the rest of the passengers. He tried to look over his shoulder, but his seatbelt held him firmly in place. He struggled against it, desperate to move, to check if the others were alive. The car groaned under its own weight, the metal frame creaking with every slight movement. It swayed on the rocks, clinging on by mere inches. The driver barely dared to breathe, afraid that even the smallest shift would send them all tumbling into the sea. When he finally managed to glance behind him, his heart sank. The child and the other passenger were completely still. He called out their names, his voice hoarse with desperation, but there was no response. He didn't know if they were unconscious or worse, but he knew one thing: if they didn't get out soon, none of them would make it out alive. People gathered at the cliff's edge, horrified at the sight of the teetering vehicle. Emergency services were on their way, but time was slipping away with each agonizing second. Inside the car, the driver was barely holding on. Blood seeped from the deep gash on his forehead, trickling down his face and into his eyes. His vision was blurry, his head throbbing with sharp, relentless pain. Every breath felt shallow, his pulse hammering in his ears like a war drum. His hands trembled as he tried to steady himself, but terror had its grip on him. The car groaned and creaked under its own weight, shifting slightly with every tiny movement. He barely dared to breathe, praying the rocks would hold. But after 30 agonizing minutes, the inevitable happened. The jagged rocks beneath the car finally crumbled. The car lurched violently, then plunged downward. The man barely had time to scream before he was weightless, tumbling through the air. The vehicle flipped as it fell, slamming against the rocky cliffside before smashing into the water below. The impact was bone-rattling. For a brief moment, the car floated, bobbing like a buoy, but the damage had already been done. Water rushed in from all sides. The man, still strapped into his seat, gasped as the icy current surged around his legs. He clawed at his seatbelt, frantically trying to unclip it, but it wouldn't budge. The cold stole his breath, and panic set in as the water level rose, creeping up his chest, then his neck. Then, just outside the shattered windshield, something moved. A shadow, long and sleek, glided through the water. Then another, a flash of gray, a fin, then another. The man's stomach twisted in sheer horror. The sharks had returned. Drawn by the scent of blood, they had gathered in numbers, circling the sinking wreckage like vultures over a fresh carcass. He knew that if he didn't get out now, he would drown, or worse, be devoured alive. The thrashing sounds behind him made his blood run cold. He turned just in time to see the sharks forcing their way into the broken back windows, their powerful bodies wedging through the wreckage. They were going for the unconscious passengers. The sight sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He had to act now. With one last desperate yank, he loosened the seatbelt and freed himself. The car was sinking fast, and soon there would be no escape. He pressed himself against the roof of the car, took one deep, desperate breath, and plunged underwater. Darkness surrounded him. The murky water blurred his vision, but he could make out the massive shapes moving all around him. Sharks circling, waiting. He stayed as still as possible, clinging to the hope that they wouldn't notice him in the chaos of the sinking wreckage. His lungs burned as he scanned for a way out. The windscreen was his only option. He pushed off the seat and kicked forward, propelling himself through the gaping hole where the windshield had once been. As he swam, the water around him clouded red. His wound. The moment his blood diffused into the sea, the sharks turned their attention. Their movements changed, faster, more deliberate. One darted toward him. He twisted, narrowly avoiding its snapping jaws, and forced himself to the surface. Breaking through the water, he gasped for air and immediately scrambled onto the car's roof. His hands slipped on the wet metal, but he managed to haul himself up, his chest heaving. He barely had a moment to collect himself before he saw the dorsal fins closing in from all directions. He wiped the blood from his face and turned his gaze toward the shore. It was so close, but the sea between him and safety was filled with death. Then he heard it, the deep, guttural sounds of the sharks as they reached the back seat. The feeding frenzy had begun. The wreckage shook violently as tails slapped the water and bodies twisted through the broken windows. The car, groaning under the pressure, tilted downward. He had seconds to decide. Stay and sink with it or dive into the water and risk everything. There was no time to hesitate. If he waited any longer, he knew there would be nothing left of him. With every ounce of strength left in his battered body, he leapt from the roof of the sinking car, propelling himself toward the shoreline. The distance was short, but to him it might as well have been miles. He knew the sharks would sense his movement, that any second a powerful jaw could clamp down on his leg and drag him under. But there was no other choice. He had to keep going. His arms carved through the water, his legs kicking furiously, every stroke bringing him closer to survival. The seconds stretched, each one filled with the unbearable tension of waiting for the inevitable attack. His lungs screamed for air, his muscles burned with exhaustion, and still he pushed forward. He braced himself, expecting the sudden searing pain of teeth sinking into his flesh. Any moment now, the pull of a predator's grip, the violent thrashing of death. But somehow, miraculously, it never came. His fingers scraped against rock, and he latched on, hauling himself onto the jagged shoreline. Coughing, shaking, barely able to believe he had made it, he turned just in time to see the car disappear beneath the surface. The sea swallowed it whole, leaving behind only ripples and red-tinged foam. Below, the sharks remained in a frenzy, their sleek bodies twisting and churning as they followed the car into the depths. Even as the wreck vanished, the water roiled with their frenzied movements. When emergency services finally reached him, the man was rushed to the hospital, barely able to process the horror he had just survived. His injuries were severe. A deep wound to his head, a strained neck, and the numbing grip of shock that would not release him for days. But he lived. He was the only one who did. His survival, however, came at a devastating cost. His friends were gone, taken in a brutal and merciless attack that no one could have foreseen. The horror of that day would haunt him forever, a nightmare that played on a loop in his mind. Over the years, Sydney Harbor had been the site of numerous shark attacks, its dark waters home to predators that ruled the depths. The exact species responsible for the attack was never confirmed, though experts suspected it was the work of bull sharks, one of the few species known to hunt in coordinated groups. It serves as a grim reminder. The moment we step into the ocean, we're no longer at the top of the food chain. We're at their mercy. It's not just Australia, though. A few decades later, two surfers in South Africa, blissfully unaware of the dangerous waters, became shark food. In July 1994, the waters off South Africa's coastline had become a hunting ground. Unbeknownst to swimmers and surfers, sharks had been drawn closer to shore in recent weeks, following migrating fish, seals, and the seasonal calving of southern right and humpback whales. The presence of these apex predators wasn't immediately obvious until it was too late. On Saturday, July 9, 1994, two friends, Bruce Corby and Andrew Carter, headed to Nahoon Reef, one of the Eastern Cape's most renowned surf spots. The area, known for hosting international competitions, boasted near-perfect conditions that day. Powerful rolling waves, a light breeze, and warm winter temperatures. For experienced surfers like Bruce and Andrew, it was an invitation they couldn't resist. As they pulled their surfboards from the roof of their car, they scanned the ocean. The sun reflected off the surface, the waves cresting at nearly 6.5 feet high. Other surfers were already in the water, carving through the swells. Strapping their leashes to their ankles, Bruce and Andrew paddled out about 220 yards, just beyond the breakers. Below them, the reef created a perfect foundation for the rising waves, the water shifting between 8 and 12 feet deep. They caught wave after wave, their bodies moving with ease, completely unaware of what lurked beneath. After surfing for about half an hour, Andrew Carter felt a sudden violent impact from behind. Even before he turned to look, he knew it could only be one thing: a shark. As he twisted around, he came face to face with a massive great white, nearly 12 feet long. A surge of terror gripped him, but there was no time to think. The shark's jaws clamped around his leg, the force crushing his bones and shredding flesh in a single bite. At first, shock and adrenaline dulled the pain, but the sheer pressure of the attack was unbearable. He let out a desperate scream, the water around him turning red as he thrashed in the shark's grip. A nearby surfer, seeing the chaos unfold, panicked and paddled frantically toward shore, leaving Andrew alone to fight for his life. The shark continued its attack, trying to pull Andrew off his board, but he clung to it with every ounce of strength he had. Just when it seemed like he would be dragged under, the predator loosened its grip. Andrew acted fast, shoving his board into the shark's mouth as it lunged again. The great white snapped down, thrashing its powerful head from side to side, momentarily distracted. Taking his only chance, Andrew swam with everything he had, but the shore was still agonizingly far. He knew he couldn't outswim the shark. A quick glance back sent a fresh wave of terror through him. The shark had released the board and disappeared below the surface. It was circling, preparing for another attack. In desperation, he scrambled back onto his board, knowing it was his only chance. John Bourne, another surfer, had seen the horrific scene unfold and rushed toward Andrew. Amidst the swirling blood in the water, John spotted an oncoming wave, their only hope. He shouted at Andrew to catch it. Incredibly, the 6-foot swell lifted Andrew up and carried him toward the shore, pushing him away from the shark's reach. His leg was barely attached, but he focused on nothing but survival, praying that the wave would take him all the way in. He refused to look back, terrified that the shark was still following. Finally, he reached the shore, collapsing in agony. Screaming for help, Andrew barely clung to consciousness. Two girls sunbathing nearby sprinted toward him, dragging him out of the surf and onto the sand. They worked frantically to slow the bleeding, using one of their tops as a tourniquet. His leg was nearly severed, hanging on by just a few inches of flesh. As his vision blurred, darkness crept in. He could hear muffled voices, feel his body growing cold. In those moments, he thought about his family, his friends, and whether this would be the end. But paramedics arrived just in time, racing to stabilize him before rushing him to the hospital. Though he had survived, his nightmare was far from over, and the shark wasn't finished. While Andrew was lucky enough to catch the wave and get hauled out of the water, Bruce was still struggling to paddle to shore. And moments after letting Andrew go, the great white launched itself toward his friend Bruce Corby. Without warning, the beast struck, its jaws clamping down on Bruce's leg with terrifying force. He barely had time to cry out before he was yanked from his surfboard and dragged under. The impact knocked the air from his lungs, and the immense pressure around his leg was unbearable. Then, in a sickening instant, the shark's jaws closed tighter, and his right leg was completely severed just above the knee. Freed from the predator's grip, Bruce kicked desperately, fighting his way to the surface. He gasped for air, blood pouring into the water around him. The shark, meanwhile, continued to attack his surfboard, thrashing violently. A nearby surfer rushed toward Bruce, trying to get him onto his board, but panic and blood loss made it nearly impossible. Struggling to stay afloat, Bruce managed to pull himself onto his own board and began a desperate attempt to reach shore. A lucky wave finally helped carry him toward the jagged rocks. As he neared the shoreline, he shouted in agony, his voice barely audible above the crashing surf. "My leg is gone! I've just lost my leg!" Surfers on the beach ran to his aid, pulling him out of the water and onto the rocks, using another surfboard as a makeshift stretcher. He had been conscious up until then, but the massive blood loss was quickly taking its toll. Just minutes after reaching the car park, Bruce lost consciousness. Paramedics were already on the scene for Andrew, and they fought to revive Bruce, stabilizing him long enough to rush him to the hospital. But tragically, he never regained consciousness. Bruce Corby was pronounced dead the next day at just 22 years old. Andrew was taken to the hospital where he stayed for 2 long, agonizing months. Although they didn't have to amputate his legs, the doctors told him he might never walk again. But after months of recovery, against all odds, he defied their expectations. He learned to walk. In the aftermath of the attack, once fully healed, Andrew left South Africa, moving to the UK for more therapy and respite. The memories of that fateful day never left him, but he defied all odds. Not only did he learn to walk, but he even returned to surfing off the southwest coast of Britain. To this day, he still keeps the surfboard from that day, stained with blood and marked with a massive bite out of its side. It serves as a chilling reminder that no matter how skilled a surfer might be, in the eyes of a shark, they are still prey. Shark attacks have long been debated. Were they cases of mistaken identity? Were humans just an accidental meal in the eyes of these apex predators? In most cases, sharks bite once and then swim away, realizing that humans are not their natural prey. But this attack had been different. This shark had shown no hesitation, no mercy. It had struck twice, aggressively, relentlessly. First Andrew, then Bruce. It hadn't been an accident. It had been a calculated assault. Bruce Corby's death served as a chilling reminder of the raw, untamed power of the ocean. Thank you for watching the video, but if you thought this was terrifying, you won't believe what's next. Watch our full compilation of the worst shark attacks ever recorded. Real stories of horror from the depths. Click now before it's too late.